Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Cal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law.
Welcome back to another episode of International Law Behind the Headlines. This is co-host Cal Raustiala, and I'm really pleased to have with us today on the podcast David Kaye. David is currently a professor at UC Irvine Law School here in California, but he was previously the special rapporteur for freedom of expression. There's a longer title, but I'll truncate it. And he's also currently the board chair of the Global Network Initiative and the recent author, or rather the author of the recent book, Speech Police. And so, as you can guess from all of those things, David has spent quite a bit of time working on issues around speech, freedom of expression, and related issues, especially as they apply in digital contexts. So a very timely topic for us. And what I thought we would do today is talk a bit about his work, but also about the implications for free speech on the internet as regarding elections and democracy more generally. So David, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Great. Thanks, Cal. It's great to be with you here.
Yeah, likewise. I should confess that David and I are not strangers. I've known him a long time, and I'm really glad to have a chance to talk about his work. So, David, maybe what we could do just to set the stage is have you explain a little bit about what the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression traditionally does, and specifically what you did. So what are some of the highlights from I think you just finished about 6 years in that post.
Yeah, that's right. Well, like all special rapporteurs for the UN, I was appointed by the Human Rights Council, and the kind of bread and butter work that all special rapporteurs do is communicating with governments, raising issues within their mandate. So for me, it was freedom of expression, but it could also be, as with others, summary executions, torture, culture. I mean, there are almost 50 special rapporteur mandates or working groups these days. So, we'd communicate with governments, we would conduct country visits. And I think, actually a significant part of the ASIL audience is familiar with the thematic reporting that we do. I would report each year to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly on some broad issue of relevance to freedom of expression. And I think that, one of the things that I saw early on, and I wasn't original on this, but the thing that seemed very clear was the way in which so much speech had moved online, and how what we now think of as a kind of digital authoritarianism had started to kind of work its way into the way in which people speak, the way in which they are kind of constrained from speaking and sharing information. And so much of my work over 6 years dealt with, at some level, the intersection of expression and opinion on the one hand, and the emerging technologies, whether it was social media, surveillance, or other areas of tech.
Great. So there's a tremendous amount to cover there, all quite interesting. But maybe what we could start with is just addressing what you see as kind of the most pressing issues over the last few years and today with regard to free expression. And then maybe we could pivot to how international law plays into that. But what are some of the key issues that you found and identified during your time as Special Rapporteur?
Yeah, and those two things really intersect. Because I think much of what I found in my work actually is relevant to the question of what law applies to these issues. So to give an example, I became very interested and did a lot of work in two particular areas. One is content moderation by social media platforms. And that means, what the platforms are doing, but also the pressure that they're under from governments. And obviously, that's like a kitchen table kind of issue for people around the world now. What is the role that social media plays in our lives, in our communications, our debates, and so forth. And the other issue was surveillance, and not just the mass surveillance, the kind of thing that Edward Snowden revealed in 2013, but also the kind of targeted surveillance that we see that has been generated by, both the demand side. Governments increasingly want cheap ways to track journalists, opposition figures, and others, but also the remarkable growth of the private surveillance industry. And so those two things I found, really troubling, but also I think, both areas where I think people are struggling to figure out what the law is, if any law, that governs these issues. So those have become big issues for me.
Well, let's get into that a little bit on what kind of law governs it. So obviously there are a number of different national laws one might either identify or propose or imagine. But at the international level, what would you point to as the most, sort of the most important bodies of law? And then relatedly, what do you think we need? So in other words, is there either a live discussion or ought there be a live discussion about some additional, let's say, treaty framework or other framework around these issues?
Yeah. Since my work was, and my mandate came from the Human Rights Council, I looked at these issues through the human rights lens. And so the basic framework is found in Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. That's like almost a quote, but it's more or less a paraphrase. And that law it's pretty expansive. And of course, it gives some ability for states to restrict expression, but it's a robust area of law, I think. And so I did most of my work focused on the human rights law implications of these new technologies. And I think you're right to focus the question on, what frameworks should we be looking for to provide us with answers to these questions, and do we need more law? I mean, I'm on the one hand, I want to say no, we don't need more law. We need the development of it and the development of normative frameworks that can develop out of human rights law. And I also feel that, and this as somebody who's studied international regimes for so many years, it's really difficult, particularly now, to imagine the international community getting together and negotiating new frameworks on things like surveillance or different kinds of tech behavior. And so I'm wary of ideas to sort of expand the treaty framework. But I also think that we're at a time when, in both the content moderation side and the private surveillance side, we're living in a kind of lawless environment. So there needs to be some focus on how we get that human rights law framework, integrated maybe into either domestic frameworks or other frameworks that can actually constrain behavior.
When you started in this position, did you imagine that elections and kind of the impact of digital content and opinion on the democratic process generally, or let's say the political process generally, would be such an important issue? Was that something that you saw right away, or was that something that developed over time?
Yeah, it honestly, it developed. When I first started in the position in 2014, surveillance was a big kind of overhanging issue. Digital security was a big issue, particularly in light of the increase in our knowledge about government surveillance, mass surveillance, and so I was focused on those things which, looking back, they look, I wouldn't say narrow, but they were somewhat granular, and I think it took kind of frankly, a couple of things. One was the Trump campaign in 2015 and 2016. With the kind of disinformation that was clearly taking place throughout his campaign, and his use of social media to make that happen. But also, as time went on, the way in which bad actors in places like Myanmar, the Philippines, and elsewhere were really weaponizing social media for really negative effects, and I think that changed the way that I saw the platforms. I mean, I think like all of us, so many of us at least, I think we're kind of we grew up to a certain extent, or we came to see social media early on and other forms of tech as this tool to expand our horizons, to expand access to information. And there were some people who saw early on the dark side of this, but I think by and large, the internet freedom agenda that was pursued by people like Hillary Clinton and others at the State Department was about all the positive things that flow from access to information online, and it took me some time to really see that the dark side of that was something that was incredibly important to focus on.
When we look at it from the vantage point of today, it's interesting to think about how you started in 2014, which was about a year, maybe even less, after the Snowden revelation started coming out. So I could imagine that surveillance was kind of a critical, seemingly overwhelming issue then. Mm-hmm. Have we sort of forgotten about that as a society, as a culture? Has that been drowned out? I mean, I want to get back into elections and the impact on elections, but is that something that we're maybe not paying as much attention to today, whereas we did in the past, and we ought to revisit?
Yeah, it's a really great question. You mean the mass surveillance kinds of?
Yeah. So the sort of things that Snowden, mass, but also specific. Snowden had so many different things that came out of that.
True.
Both mass and targeted against certain individuals, but the fear at the time seemed to me to be, look at what the NSA in particular, but what other big government agencies can do, mm-hmm. how scary that was. Whereas the private sector sort of had a role, but it seemed smaller. And now the fear is Facebook is destroying our lives.
Right. I think, there's always this risk that we have. And this isn't just an American thing. I mean, we all have a kind of short attention span, right? So like if you think about the last 10 years, the different issues that have taken up a lot of our mental space and our worrying space have been, things like surveillance. They've been big data was a kind of a tag word for a while. Algorithmic decision making and AI and the opacity of that decision making, and now social media and its power over our lives, and the AI stuff intersects with that. So, I'm not sure that we've forgotten about those things. I think those things will come back. I think, and they come back in part by what we see in the news. So just to give an example, one of the things that I focused on with Agnes Callamard, who's the Special Rapporteur on Summary Executions, was the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the intersection of that with surveillance. And, I think that people, we're really alive to that intersection for a while, and then it kind of fades a bit. There's going to be a couple of films coming out over the next month or two about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the role of surveillance of dissidents as well. And I think, I think it'll be a real test for, let's say we have a Democratic administration in the United States next. It'll be a real test for them to figure out how do we address these problems that are not just domestic problems, but they're global ones, and there isn't a clear legal framework to deal with them. And, bringing back that sense of, that you describe of kind of fear of kind of out of control surveillance, I think that's going to be part of the work of policymakers to remind us of, how out of control surveillance internationally is a problem for all of us.
Yes. So, here we obviously have an election coming up rapidly, but we're not the only country that has had issues around let's say, expression and social media meeting
Yeah.
democracy in an unhelpful way, and that's probably putting it mildly. So, this is a global issue, not an American issue, but it does seem particularly acute here in the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah.
And so, I guess I'm curious, what you think. So, you talked about how can we address this legally? How can we comport with existing human rights instruments? What can we do, if anything, in the near term around disinformation and the way that social media is often used to whip up hatred and actually maybe even to foment genocides? What can we do anything in the short term, and then in the longer term, what would you counsel we do? Are there legal solutions that you think are handy, or is it something that's going to take an enormous amount of work to formulate?
Yeah, I mean the short-term fixes are. None of this is easy, right? It's. I don't want to give the impression that I think that all of this can be fixed. I mean, there was or can be fixed easily or quickly. I always have in mind, after Trump was elected, the New York Times. It was like November of 2016. The New York Times had an editorial where they basically said something like, surely Facebook's programmers can find a way to spot bogus stories and zap them from the platform. And the technology isn't that easy. The human capital, the human labor part of this, it's not that easy to do that kind of work. There's also a flood of this information. So we're going to have to rely on AI, on automation to deal with some of this. We're also dealing with a situation where you've got people who are working from home now and doing this kind of content moderation over election disinformation. I mean, my view is over the very short term, and we're talking about weeks, because it's not just that we have an election looming. I mean, we are in the election. People are already voting in the United States for president. Early voting has started. And I think that the major platforms in the United States, and the New York Times actually did an editorial on this over the weekend. Or on Monday, the major platforms should all get together right now and say, this is what we're going to do about election disinformation. It doesn't have to be about all misinformation, but particularly about voter disinformation. And they should be clear about what their rules are. They should have a joint commitment to take action against it. I mean, now is the time to do it. And it would be, I think, a signaling exercise as much as, a practical exercise in identifying, across platforms, what kind of disinformation is really seeking to suppress the vote. I mean, I think there's like a near-term thing that has to be done. I mean, the longer-term question is, what kind of regulation, particularly, I mean, if we're thinking about the United States, what kind of regulation is possible that would be consistent with the First Amendment? But it's also a global issue. What kind of regulation can we imagine that would also be consistent with the right to freedom of expression around the world? And I think, I mean, that's a trickier one, but I think there's possibilities out there for addressing the long term.
What are some of the platforms doing now with regard to, let's say, disinformation or voter suppression or things? I have the impression that there were some actions maybe Twitter was taking. I may be the last person left on earth who's not a Facebook user. But I had the impression that Twitter at least had taken some steps, but what's actually happened so far?
Yeah, I mean, so they've tried to tighten their rules. At least they're saying, we are going to address voter disinformation. We're going to address information about ballots and when it comes to what Trump and the people around Trump are doing, it's pretty vast. The concern isn't just about bad actors providing people with bad information about where they can vote. It's also about the whole, kind of environment of saying mail-in ballots are bad. They're about, fraud and so forth, which is, at some level designed to lay the groundwork for what what Trump might do after the election, but also I think is designed to demoralize voters and to suppress the vote. And so the platforms, I think, are saying, we're going to address that. Several of them have adopted new tools, and Twitter and Facebook have definitely done this, where they label what they see as disinformation. So they have a rule, they see a violation, and they might have a label on it. I think like the take on those labels so far, I think among people watching this, is that they're pretty weak. They don't do enough. They're not necessarily taking down bad information. They're just maybe creating some friction, so it's harder to get at. I think the other problem, and there was, I think it was an FT story the other day highlighted this, where Nick Clegg, who's I think the head of global policy at Facebook, basically said that we're aiming to address this, but some of the hard questions will be decided by him, by Sheryl Sandberg, by Mark Zuckerberg, and that's a real problem, because it's clear that political pressure and the kind of pressure that we've seen stories about in the context of conservatives in particular trying to kind of game the system and to get Zuckerberg in particular not to take action against Trump, that I think casts a pretty bad light on the idea of having neutral rules that are applied neutrally and objectively. And so I'm pretty concerned that this idea that they're going to be able to address disinformation is something that they're actually going to be able to do without the kind of political pressure that can influence them.
What's wrong with the labeling approach? So I guess, I understand it might be inadequate as a practical matter, in the same way that putting calorie counts or sugar content on the label of a food product isn't going to stop people from eating it.
Yeah.
But is that not consistent with a host of other either rights or just assumptions about life in an open society, that ultimately all we can realistically do is label and let people make their own decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. It highlights the tensions that are involved here. I mean, disinformation isn't, first of all, there's no commonly held definition of disinformation. And not only that, human rights law doesn't say, everyone has the right to seek and receive information that's true. It's information and ideas of all kinds. And so I completely agree with your point that there's this tension in a free society over how to address these things. But I do think that the platforms have an obligation to consider the way in which they're weaponized or they're abused, and also the kind of reach that they have that isn't the normal kind of reach that one speaker has in different in other kinds of contexts. And so here I would say the platforms need to be thinking about, like, if we are identifying disinformation that is specifically designed to attack voting rights, let's say, then we have a host of possibilities to address that. And yes, people should be able to make up their own minds. That's absolutely essential, of course. But can you create more friction so that it's clearer that the kind of information that they have identified as disinformation is in fact disinformation that is designed to undermine the democratic process? And the label doesn't always do it. There are other ways that they can do this. They can limit the reach. They can make it so that you don't actually see the post right off, and you see some label that essentially says this is a tweet of the President of the United States. We're not taking it down because he's the President of the United States, and so there's some newsworthiness in it, but you should know that this is false information. And then you click on it and then you see it. That kind of friction, I think, has a fairly strong effect on people. There's some research that what's known as pre-bunking is better than allowing the lie to be out there and then trying to address it. And I think that, the platforms can do that. It doesn't do away with the tension that you're identifying, but I think there's a kind of responsibility that they have in the face of these attacks.
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems plausible that kind of pre-bunking, that's a word I'd never heard before, but it makes sense that might be more effective. On the other hand, it does seem to give even more power to, let's say, Facebook for a moment. It would seem like the ability to do that just gives them ever more power. Is that kind of inevitable here?
That's the other tension. Like pretty much every idea that's out there that is costly, right? And also that puts the platforms in the center of decision making does exactly that. It reinforces their power. And so I think this goes back to your initial question about sort of the short and the long term. So I think over the short term, there are clearly steps that need to be taken to deal with real threats. But over the long term, we do need to be thinking about what are the tools out there that not only address real harms and that have to be defined harms, not just generic harms, but what are the threats that are out there? What are the tools that we can adopt to address them? And how can we do it in a way that maintains the possibility for innovation, for entry into the market of new players, and also gives a voice to democratic governments. All of these issues are real long-term issues. They need to be on the agenda. For too long, particularly in the United States, we've talked about them in a highly politicized way. The European Union is now considering a Digital Services Act that's going to, over time, be like the GDPR, the privacy regulations for the internet economy. And this will be more about, censorship, speech, the intersection with privacy and all of these different issues. And they're handling it in a fairly straightforward, professional way. It's going to get messy, but these are issues that we definitely have to address over the long term with democratic regulation.
So would you say that the EU is handling it the best at this point? Are there governments or regional entities that you want to single out for some praise in terms of how they've tackled these problems?
Yeah, there's not a lot of best practice out there, but so far, and I wouldn't say that the EU has been across the board strong on this. They're sort of their early steps, like 4, 5, 6 over the last 4 or 5 years, especially, have been pretty problematic. So oftentimes they're kind of backroom deals between the European Commission and the biggest platforms that are forms of pressure on the platforms, but they're not transparent. They don't involve civil society in the making of those new rules and so forth. And you get things like this. There's a voluntary code of conduct to deal with hate speech. That's one example. And, very few people were involved in developing that code of conduct. But I think now, the process has opened up in a way, and the Commission has created a mechanism for public input. And I think the debate will be pretty robust. And it seems like it's heading, I can't say it's heading in the right direction. It's too early to say that. But at least in terms of democratic accountability and transparency, it seems to be heading in a pretty positive direction. When you look at states, like members of the EU, there are not really that many good examples of doing this. And so I think one hope that a lot of people have is that the EU and the Commission in particular will create a model of democratic lawmaking and regulation of tech that can be, a model for the states, but also a model for others, particularly as authoritarian governments are going exactly in the opposite direction.
What kind of role has the UN played in this, or should it play? And I would include, subsidiary agencies and agencies like the ITU even. Have they been involved? Has it been helpful? Is it realistic to expect anything helpful out of an organization like the ITU?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. The ITU has been a place where, basically there's been this debate over the extent to which these issues should be multilateralized. And, multilateralism, like for us, I think that's a good word. But the Chinese, the Russians, and some others have been proposing multilateral efforts to control big tech, basically, that are really designed to give governments more power over tech and, frankly, more authoritarian power over tech. And so they've actually been trying to use the ITU as the location for those kinds of efforts. And there's been a lot of resistance. I mean, European governments have resisted that. The United States, for a long time, has resisted that in favor of what's thought of as a kind of multi-stakeholder approach. So it's governments, it's companies, it's academics, it's civil society involved in thinking about these issues. The UN could have a role in doing some of this. I still think that the Human Rights Council can play a normative role in framing these issues as human rights issues. But I think a lot of this is going to happen over the medium term at the regional levels, particularly at the EU level in Brussels, and to some extent at national levels, as different governments, including the United States, think about how to regulate this space.
I completely agree about the multilateralism versus multi-stakeholder kind of debate that's taken place with so many things on the internet. And, in many ways, multilateralism is really code for greater state control. And what's so hard about this set of problems is, on the one hand, a few minutes ago, we talked about, do we really want to empower Facebook to be doing even more to control how speech is understood and seen and filtered? But I'm not sure that I want the ITU to be doing it either. And so it's not clear what the right balance or what is even possible as a balance, which is, I suppose, what makes this such an interesting area.
Yeah, so, and I think that I think that's a really important point, and it's really tricky. I mean, all of this involves different sorts of tensions, and I think that, look, if Joe Biden wins, hopefully, I mean, everybody's got a Christmas tree of things that they would want a Democratic administration to do. But I think, as we think about what the tech world and regulation of tech internationally should look like, I think one hope that I would have would be that a Democratic administration would engage with traditional, liberal democratic states in this space and really start to think through what would be what's the counter to the vision, which is really a vision that's presented by the Chinese and the Russians. And I think certainly over the last 4 years, we haven't seen enough of that. And I think that'll be a real challenge for the democratic world and for the rule of law respecting world to think about, well, what does this area look like? And given that so many people think there needs to be regulation of that space, what does democratic regulation look like? It's a huge, huge challenge.
Agreed. So just as we get toward the end of our time, we talked a lot about kind of content on particular platforms and what we might do about something that's, truly disinformation. But what about the control of entire platforms? So I'm thinking about, we've talked mostly about Facebook, a little bit about Twitter, but we have the current debate over TikTok, WeChat, and of course in China, many platforms based out of the United States are blocked. And so how does that fit into this whole debate that we're having?
Yeah, it's true. We, so often, and it's weird that it took Trump to raise this, but for so long, the debate internationally has been about, basically Facebook to some extent Twitter, to a big extent YouTube. And, I think the debate, and I, share some of the responsibility for this, has not focused enough attention on these other platforms. And, and it's true, WeChat and TikTok have, some pretty significant problems about them. I mean, WeChat in particular is very much a platform, particularly in China, but also when it comes to Chinese content around the world, that is subject to censorship demands of the government of the People's Republic of China. And so, that fact, I think, is something that we need to be thinking about more as we think about global regulation of technology and of social media platforms and others. And I think at the domestic level, as we think about what Trump is proposing, both around things like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, but also specific orders around TikTok and WeChat, are that, I think it's very much wrapped up in the politicized way that Trump and some others in the conservative space have viewed technology, and particularly social media platforms. So when it comes to TikTok and WeChat, it's hard to kind of separate out Trump's anti-China, which verges on, if isn't explicitly racist in some respects, or at least xenophobic, his attack on the Chinese virus, and kind of giving blame to China for all sorts of things. It's hard to separate that out from the genuine concerns that we should have about WeChat and TikTok. And so far, and actually I think this is where human rights law can be helpful to us. People use WeChat and TikTok for legitimate freedom of expression purposes, right? To communicate with others, to share information, to debate, et cetera, for entertainment. And if there's going to be any restriction on those, it's up to government. Like, government has the burden of demonstrating why it's necessary, why it's proportionate to do something like ban a platform from the United States. And I don't think that the Trump administration has shown that. And so, I think these are, issues of both global regulation and domestic regulation. And I think what Trump is doing with respect to these platforms here is deeply problematic, because it gives all sorts of governments the kind of clue, or the kind of open door to also attack platforms, and to attack American platforms that don't have the same problems that TikTok and WeChat might have. They may have different kinds of problems, but it certainly opens up the door to regulation that isn't friendly to freedom of expression.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to wrap things. And David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I hope we can have you back again soon.
Thanks, Cal. This was a lot of fun.